Hey everyone, welcome back. So I'll give it about another minute or so as folks start to log in, but I see Jeff is on. So Jeff, if you want to start projecting.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to go off video for bandwidth issues. And hopefully you can see a slide that says slice of day resource counting and penalty process.
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Maybe I'll try to go on camera, but if it gets glitchy, I'll go off.
Okay, I think we can get started.
Okay, well, I'll take it away. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Nelson from Southern California Edison. Hopefully you can see the screen that's up there with the Slice of Day presentation, and you can hear me pretty clearly. I should have good audio. If it starts getting glitchy, let me know. Sometimes I have bandwidth issues. I'll go off video, and that sometimes clears up my audio. Okay, so I've got a whole hour here, but I don't think the presentation is going to take that long. So I'd like to see if we could get as many questions. If there's questions at the end, if you can sort of hit us up. Unfortunately, because this was extended at the last minute, I have a hard stop, and I'm not able to be available past 3 o'clock. So if people have questions on this, we'll try to save time to make sure I can answer anything in the presentation. Okay, so what I want to talk about here, and let me go to the conversation sideboard. I'll try to keep an eye on that, but if the host can help me, if there's questions I need to address, please let me know. I'm just going to give a quick recap of the 24 slice proposal, just really quick. We're going to talk about the CPUC showing and penalty process. We really haven't talked much about this. We've gone brief on it, got some questions offline, and I just want to be clear on how we're envisioning it in this proposal. And we've had some various other conversations about going to a 24-hour shape proposal. The whole concept of a single NQC value doesn't work for resources that are profiled. And we're going to talk about what needs to evolve to make sure that the PUC and the ISO are looking at apples to apples when they're doing their tests. And we'll talk through that. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all this detail. There's a slide in here for the background. Again, our proposal is that each LSC is going to have its own load shape. We'll work through the CEC to get that determined. And each LSC will have to meet both the load shape plus planning reserve margin to be determined. And they have to meet that in every hour, all 24 hours. We have profiles that are used for solar and wind that will represent the performance that we agree to is acceptable for the counting purposes. Batteries can be shown. I wanted to add a little bit of a clarification. There may have been some confusion on some earlier things we said on batteries. Batteries can be shown subject to their capabilities. And they can be shown in any hour a person wants to use them. But let's just say if it's got a 4-hour runtime, it can't be shown 8 hours continuously, even though it may be able to show 8 hours throughout the day. It's not subject to its capability to be 8 hours of continuous run without any time for charging in it. So there may have been some confusion in what we said earlier. I wanted to clarify that. But if the battery is capable of doing multiple cycles per day, fine, it can do 2 cycles a day. Or who knows how the technology is going to evolve. But whatever subject to its capabilities, it can be shown. Hybrid resources have both a supply and a demand component. We think that there's some details there that we'd still like to talk through eventually in implementing this. And then typical other resources, if they've got use limits, I think ISO was talking about a peaker who had noise limits. Those would be reflected, and they'd only be shown in the CPUC showing, again, subject to their capability. If they're not available, I forget what the example was, hours 2 to 5 in the morning, you can't show them in hours 2 to 5. It's got a permit restriction, but you can show them in all the other hours where they're not restricted. And then typical, traditional gas-fired resources without restrictions. be shown 24 hours and be shown in all 24 hours. And the NQC, again, we're not sure how exactly the UCAP is going to evolve, but whatever it officially counts for in resource adequacy, whether it's a derated NQC from a UCAP value, or if we don't go that way, it's just the NQC. That's what's shown. So I've touched through most of this stuff. One other thing, once a resource is shown, it has a full capability must offer. So even if it's only shown for a couple hours, it's got a must offer all the time. The must offer is not tied to the hours of the showing. Once a resource is shown, it has a must offer. There's no unbundling of attributes. A 100 megawatt resource is able to sell 75 megawatts of its capability to LSE-A and say 25 megawatts to LSE-B, that's fine. But the resource is not allowed to say, I'm selling hours 1, 7, and 11, or maybe 3 is a prime number, and there are 2 to one LSE, and the other hours I'm selling to another. No, once you sell, you've sold for the full capability up to the quantity or capacity you've sold. Full must offer. I'm getting a bad network signal on my side, so I'm going to go off video and keep talking. Hopefully you can still hear me clearly. And use limitations we've talked about will be shown. There's no requirement for MCC buckets because we're shaping. We don't see a requirement for flex. And then we finally get to what this presentation is really about, the penalty structure. Okay, so that was all review. I'm going to move on to the sort of the meat of this proposal. So basically, we want to stick with the same concepts, the same structures of penalties that we have today. The only difference, the only nuance is we still have a single monthly showing, but you show all 24 hours at once. If you fail any hour, you fail. Right? Today, it's a single point showing. I think in the grid well, you have 2 points. This has 24 slices. If you fail in any of those slices, you fail, and you're now subject to penalties. And if you fail in multiple hours, whatever your worst hour is on a megawatt deficiency, that's what you're deemed to fail. In addition to failing, if you do fail, you'd be subject to PUC penalties, and we're proposing the same penalties we've got in place now, the same structure. But you'd also be eligible, or first in line, we call it, to receive backstop cost allocation if the ISO concludes it needs to backstop because of deficiencies. And that's similar today, right? Similar, same principles, same ideas. If an LSE is short and the ISO has a deficiency and the ISO backstops, that LSE is sort of first in line. And we view that as sort of a megawatt first in line. If they're 1 megawatt short and the ISO buys 100 megawatts of replacement, they would only get 1 megawatt worth of the cost directly, not all 100 megawatts. And again, we understand that's how it works today, but same thing. So generally, it's the same principles, except if you fail in any of the 24 hours, you failed. Today, it's only 1 point. If you fail on that point, you fail. Let me just go through this slide. I see a hand has come up, but let me just talk through this slide to sort of illustrate this with a graph. So we've got this is an LSE. We don't have sort of the y-axis labeled. So this is a pretty small LSEs. You'll see my numbers. They have a 24-hour load shape that looks like this yellow tan line. We put a planning reserve margin on this green line. That's their obligation. They have to have enough resources in every hour to at least touch that green line. We've used solar here. Maybe it's an unfortunate color of blue. It's supposed to be solar instead of hydro here. And we used their batteries to fill in this sort of gap here. And there's a little bit of battery here too. And one other constraint we have is that you have to have brought enough excess capacity plus what we've said is the efficiency losses of the batteries you're using to make sure you have enough excess capacity in other hours to take care of the energy needs when you're using your batteries. So this showing, this LSE is good. Every of the 24 hours, it touches or exceeds It's in good shape. It's got plenty of capacity to deal with the battery's capacity here. Pass. Now let's do another situation. It's kind of supposed to be the same shape and the like, but this LSE looks good in the morning. They got plenty of excess. They can cover their batteries. But in this sort of hypothetical, they don't have as many batteries. And as a result, they have 3 hours that they didn't make it. They're not touching their green line. So they failed. Even if this was 1 hour, even if it was 1 hour and hour 2, you don't touch your green line, you fail. You failed your showing. And since this person has multiple hours that they failed, their failure is considered whatever the maximum is. So I've got an example coming up that let's just say this is 5, 4, and 3 megawatts. They'd be deemed to have failed by 5 megawatts. So yeah, I said I wanted to take questions, but let me just finish this slide here. So this person would right away be subject to CPUC penalties. Boom. And in this, I'm saying 5 megawatts right away. This person's good. They get nothing. So assume they were 5 megawatts short in 19. They're subject to the penalties right away. Now the Cal ISO is going to go through their deficiency process, and they're going to stack people up, and we'll talk a little bit more how they do it. But they're going to determine if the showings they've received create a deficiency or not. And to the extent they create a deficiency, they have the ability to backstop. So let's assume that they have got everyone's showings in. They are finding the showings are deficient, and the ISO is going to backstop. And again, this hypothetical, they're going to backstop for 100 megawatts. So you can say grid-wide, they had a 100 megawatt deficiency. Let's just make sure, let's pretend that everything lined up perfectly and there was no lumpiness. Okay, so in addition to failing and getting PUC penalties, this LSE would also, as we see it, be first in line to get 5/100ths of the backstop cost. 5% would go right to that LSE. So by failing, they get the PUC penalties, and they're first in line to get a share of the backstop costs. And assume there are a whole bunch of other people that had failed somewhere else, we would, assert that the remaining backstop costs went to everyone who also failed. To the extent there was lumpiness and the ISO bought more than there was a failure, if only it was a 100 megawatt deficiency, but the ISO had to buy 125 megawatts, we would, my understanding is we smear all the excess to everybody, depending on the cause of the backstop, if it was local or system. I may have that wrong. It's a bit of a nuance. But assuming they don't over backstop, we'd allocate it directly to the people that were deficient and causing the backstopping costs. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. I see a couple hands. I don't know how to call people, so if I could get help from the host. I see, it looks like Harry's at the very top of the set.
Harry's the first one.
Hey, Jeff, Carrie Bentley with Goodwill Consulting. I have questions on this, but I'll let Kathleen and Matt go first. I just had a quick question on your slide 2 or 3, I think it was, on the must offer obligation. So assuming we go to oh yeah, this one, perfect, thank you. So assuming we go to an hourly UCAP, where you have a different resource value for each hour, is the must offer are you proposing the must offer to be the same in every hour, or up to the UCAP value in every hour?
I'm not really sure we've thought through how an hourly UCAP works. My understanding, even with the UCAP, though, and people can help me, if a 100 megawatt resource gets a UCAP duration to, let's just say, 93 megawatts, it only counts for 93 megawatts of capacity. And stop me if I'm going off the tracks here. But in order to get even 93, it still has to offer 100.
Yeah, so I guess I was wondering if, maybe Partha can clarify. He just raised his hand. Yeah, I think that's true. And I was just unclear when you said in all hours, whether then they would essentially have that 100 must offer in all hours, or whether it'd be an hourly MU. But maybe that's a Partha question.
Yeah, and I would say my framing of this is that in all hours they're capable, they would have the 100 megawatt MU. If it was that peaker that had that 2 to 5 permit, It's not capable, so it doesn't have a must offer in hours 2 to 5.
Bridget is saying you wouldn't have an hourly UCAP. So maybe that's something she could clarify.
Yeah, I thought it was seasonal. I thought they were proposing seasonal, but that's the first time I've heard the ISO walk through the details of that proposal, and I may just not have caught all the nuances.
Well, I guess there's what the CAISO is proposing, and then there's what SCE is proposing. So I thought I heard you say you were proposing an hourly UCAP, but maybe you're just proposing whatever the CAISO is proposing.
Yeah, as part of this proposal, we're not going to sort of UCAP or RAIM. It's not part of this proposal. Whatever that capacity is counted for, it has to have must offer to the however it got that rating, whatever capacity it needed to get that rating, it has to offer that capacity.
Okay, but you're
right
not,
now it's NQC.
Resource counting
Right
rules.
now it's NQC. I'm sorry, Carrie, I spoke over you.
Oh, no, I was saying, so you're not proposing any specific resource counting rules for gas then?
As part of this proposal, no.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful, Jeff.
Next, we have Kathleen.
Hi, great. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have a couple clarifying questions about on the penalty side, less the framework. Yeah, maybe this is a good one. So I didn't see this or hear this, and if I missed it, my bad. But can you just confirm for me that when the shortfall is identified, that the penalty you're proposing is the same penalty that we have? So 888 per kilowatt month for summer months, or 44 per kilowatt month in non-summer months, that it's that same value, you're just applying this method to get to the shortfall?
Yeah, we've never sort of said numbers. I know the Calpine position paper does. What we've said is we keep the same penalty structure, and those numbers have evolved over time, but the concept is same penalty structure.
Understood. And if they were updated, they'd be updated. And so maybe that answers my other questions of, we keep the same idea of deficiencies cured within 5 business days, have a different approach, but the shortfall is the worst hour that's short that you'd use for that 10 megawatt? Okay.
Or yeah, and our some of our logic with kind of the worst hour is you can kind of any hour, you can kind of move your flexible resources around and maybe create a hole anywhere you want, just depending on what you have. And if there was one magic hour that we were going to look at for penalties, we're concerned that people would, create a whole bunch of holes elsewhere in their showing because they know there's no penalty and fill the hole where the penalty hour is. So we thought the easiest way is to say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you fail. If you don't touch the green line, hour 6, hour 18, it's the same thing. You've failed.
I think that makes sense. I just had maybe a conceptual question, and I was mentioning the worst hour and just wanted to lock that one down, because when I first was hearing you talk through it, Jeff, I was wondering, well, is this muting the incentive to comply in every hour if you're only picking an hour? But as long as it's the worst, it seems like it would be still providing that incentive. So that's kind of why I wanted to confirm that. Is that the same?
Yeah, and what we mean by worst is the hour where you were the most deficient. If you were the most deficient in hour 2, that would be the worst hour on sort of a megawatt deficiency. The worst is not in the context of operational difficulty. In this context, it's relative to the green line. Whatever hour you miss the green line by the most, that's the quantity that you're going to get penalized.
No, I understand. Thank you for explaining. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, next we have Matt.
Hey, Jeff, this is Matt Barmack from Calpine.
Hey, Matt.
This is something I plan to discuss a little bit later, but I figured it'd be good to surface it now. So I just wondered on I guess it's a slide after this, and sort of who's first in line for CPM. I guess two questions. One is like, I'm assuming that the CAISO is going to validate something specific, like a single slice. And what if the PUC assessed deficiencies are in other hours than what the ISO is validating? Then how do you see the potential allocation of CPM costs working in that case? And then also, something I think we've discussed, if there's going to be some allocation of CPM, sort of maybe down to the PUC and then to individual load serving entities, does that, like, is some tariff change required? I just wonder if you could comment on either one of those questions.
So let me start with the first one. So let's just say that this person was deficient in whatever I said, hour 19 was the worst, but they were okay in hour 18.
Yep.
Right. And then the ISO goes and tests and they find a deficiency in hour 18. They test hour 18.
Exactly.
I think that's your hypothetical.
Yeah.
Yes, our proposal is we don't care, right? They could have shifted their battery here in hour 18 and put it on hour 19 and moved a little bit from hour 20 over here potentially, and then they would have been short in hour 18. So our philosophy, we don't care. If they're deficient, they should be getting first sloth of deficiency costs.
Yeah, I guess I'm probably just not thinking about this clearly, but the hypothetical that I had in mind is, one LSE is deficient in hour 18, say 100 megawatts, and the CAISO catches it, and a completely different LSE is deficient in hour 19 and fail the PUC test, but they pass the CAISO test. Are all the CPM costs going only to the LSE who was deficient in hour 18, because that's what CAISO was checking?
So our short answer is no.
Okay.
It would go to the person who was deficient in hour 19 also.
Mm-hmm.
But then it gets into your second question about tariff changes.
Yeah.
So if let's just say the person that was deficient in hour 18 was a non-CPUC entity.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way, and people can correct me here, this is complicated, and I'm kind of on my own on this one. My technical person was out of the office today. My understanding is that the ISO allocates deficiency dollars to like local regulatory authorities, and then that gets sort of passed down from the local regulatory authority, how the local regulatory authority deems fit. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong there. So if that's the case, and they were looking at hour 18, and it was an LSE that was not a CPUC LSE, it's possible the CPUC would never receive money, and therefore they wouldn't have any penalty to allocate to their person that was short in hour 19.
Okay, yeah, maybe somebody from I think that's right, and that's potentially problematic. I'm not sure the CPM cost for LSE deficiencies go first to the LRA, but maybe somebody from the CAISO can comment on that. Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, carrying on. So we don't think there's tariff. Well, we don't think there's tariff changes needed for the penalty allocation. When I go on to the next part of the presentation, there might be tariff changes that we think are needed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Jeff, we have two other people in the queue. Did you want to continue or take those questions?
I've got till technically 1:30, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's take the questions now.
Okay, Sergio, you're next.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes, hi, Sergio.
Hi, Jeff. I had one quick question back to your table that sort of summarizes the proposal. In terms of resource counting for standalone batteries, I know we've been talking about the potential for multiple cycles and the need to verify downtime or something like that. Could you comment on those pieces, how they've evolved in your proposal?
Yeah, so originally we said one cycle only because we couldn't figure out how to do it. And then people convinced us that, batteries are capable of multiple cycles. They can really do it. And then we sort of evolved. And again, this is probably language that was not crystal clear, that, hey, subject to capabilities. So if they really are capable of doing multiple cycles in a day, we were okay with that, but it still had to be subject to capability. So that's where I was saying, if a battery is really capable of 4 hours of discharge and they can do that 2 times a day, fine, we'll show them 2 hours of discharge, but there has to be enough time to fill the battery up between those cycles. You can't just be 8 hours straight, because that's not consistent with what they're capable of doing, unless they're at half power.
Okay, so basically what this means is you can do multiple cycles, but there would be some form of downtime verification. Would that be assuming symmetric discharge and charge capability, or is that like a tech by tech basis?
Yeah, we assumed it would be symmetric. If something different, if people got quick charging, I think there's going to be a lot of, as technology evolves, we're going to have to make sure the rules fit the new technology. We assume we start symmetric and look at losses.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Jeff.
This is for starting, because we're not trying to do a full optimization in the showing, because in real life, the optimization is going to optimize it, right? It's going to do what makes sense in real life, in real operations, but the optimization is never going to discharge a 4-hour battery at full capability for 8 hours straight. That just can never happen.
Thanks for that.
Standalone. So that's a concept, subject to capability. Yeah, we weren't crystal clear on that before, so I apologize.
Okay, next.
Carrie, are you back?
Yeah, Carrie Bentley, Gridwell Consulting. I just wanted to answer your question about how CPM worked. So
Yes,
yeah, first there has to be a collective deficiency. So in your example, if there was excess in that hour 18 and someone else was short, then they net each other out. So
zero CPM.
Okay. Yeah, so first there has to be collective deficiency, and then after that, it's based on pro rata to each LSC based on the proportion to its deficiency, and that's tariff section 43A.8.4. So it's different than TAC area or how local is done. It is by LSC. So I think you would need some tariff changes.
Yeah, we might, because the idea is to get the person to not dodge that hour through their CPUC showing.
Yeah,
that's our intent.
Makes sense. Yeah. So I think it would work for CPUC, but with CAISO, you would need rule changes for the CPM.
Thank you. I think Partha jumped in.
Yeah, no, thanks, Carrie. We were just coordinating the response, and at least I would say at a high level, the conversation, at least that Jeff, you were having with Matt, I think that those are sort of the right questions to ask in terms of how the processes can align well. We certainly have that. I think there's probably broader questions that we have as well in terms of how our systems might need to be updated. How we can receive data. Currently, our process only allows us to accept, one showing value to basically be converted into an NQC per resource. And those data sources are important. How it would be aligned with different LRAs in terms of assessing the collective deficiency and assigning it back. We internally at least ask questions on, well, maybe we have separate processes for different LRAs, maybe we have a separate process for the CPUC versus other LRAs. And so I'm not wanting to prejudge the answer to the questions. I just think those are things that we'll likely have to address during sort of our own CAISO stakeholder process. So, I think that this is really great that we're vetting this here in this venue, because I do think it will could help inform sort of the direction that the PUC takes. But it's, we kind of recognize as well that we're, we're needing to go down a path in the PUC venue without necessarily complete information and clarity in terms of how all those processes will work together at the ISO as well. So yeah, thanks again, Jeff, for teeing those up.
Yeah, and just an aside here, I mean, there may be some like pretty easy workarounds, like if this person was short 5 megawatts here, but the ISO is going to test hour 18, that is part of the handoff from the CPUC showing to the ISO, now that we know they're going to test hour 18, is they subtract out capacity of 5 megawatts in your deficiency test somehow, and then it doesn't let them dodge the hour that's being tested.
Yeah, that makes sense as a goal. I certainly can understand that perspective.
We don't want people dodging it by using their use limited resources to, what was some of the gaming, some of the capacity markets. You tried to pick the highest hour of the year, and you used as much demand response as you could, and therefore next year it looked like you were a lower load and you got a lower requirement because you did good on 1 hour. We're trying to avoid that sort of gamesmanship. And that was something I read about in the East Coast. I wasn't saying it happened here. Okay.
Nope, doesn't look like any other questions, so I think you can go to the next slide.
Okay, so we talked about this, about sort of trying to give the first in line for people that are short for the backstopping costs. This is an important one, and this is where we think there's going to have to be some changes in the communication and the coordination of the ISO and the PUC. And the tests that the PUC is doing and what the ISO is doing, they have to harmonize. They don't have to be the same, but they have to be in agreement on what they're doing and why they're doing it. So right now, as we were talking about, I think, Carrie, NQC is kind of this magic value that gets used, kind of the one number for the 1 point that's being tested. I think in the grid well, I don't want to speak too much. There's 2 points that are being tested, so there'd probably be like something like 2 NQCs, one for each point. But right now there's a single NQC, and that's sort of assumed for solar, which gives you the strange effects of them having certain production in the middle of the night. And part of the reason we're saying, no, that's not the way to do it. And under the 24 slice framework, we're going to have hourly profiles, especially for wind and solar. And that whole sort of NQC concept for these resources kind of loses its meaning in a lot of ways in the 24 showing. And importantly, I use a hypothetical here. And again, if I got my numbers wrong, it's supposed to be in the ballpark. Assume there's a 100 megawatt solar facility. And under the current process, they go through and it's a fully deliverable solar facility. And in September, let's say, it's only getting an NQC of 15 megawatts. So when the ISO does its deficiency test, when the ISO does its stacking test, it's only counting that wind as 15 megawatts. When the PUC is doing its test, it's only counting the wind as 15 megawatts. But in the 24-hour shape, this wind has a lot of different value. I'm sorry, this solar has a lot of different values. And yeah, it may be 15 megawatts here, but in this hypothetical, an hour 18, it's 41. Big difference between 41 and 15. So if the ISO doesn't do anything and decides it's going to test hour 18 as sort of the important hour, and I guess right now we don't really say what hour it is, sort of like the gross peak hour is sort of implicitly there because they do a stacking based on sort of the peak target. But if they're going to do hour 18, if they don't change their process, they're just going to assume that this solar has 15 megawatts. But this solar, when it made its showing, was counting for 41 megawatts at the PUC. So the ISO has to know that, and they need to count the resource not as 15 megawatts. They need to count it as 41 megawatts when they're doing their deficiency test. And if the ISO decides to do some other hour, maybe they're now getting concerned after the sun goes down or whatever. Not only are they going to have to use the appropriate value for solar when the sun's down, like 0, but they're also going to have to use the appropriate value of system load because they're going to be stacking things based on what they were shown at for 24 hours. And there's not a single point load target we're hitting anymore. There's 24 point targets. So whatever the ISO decides is going to be its test, its point, and right now we're working under the assumption the ISO is only going to test one point. They're going to have to be consistent and use both the value of capacity that the PUC was equating to these resources, and they're going to have to agree on a system load that corresponds to that hour. You can't have them stack the capacity for hour 22 and compare it against the load of hour 18. You'll come up short. If you're concerned about hour 22, you need to use the capacity shown for hour 22 and the load that's associated. And that just doesn't work today because it's a point estimate. Everything's a point. Everything's one number. If the ISO didn't do that, they short that showing of 26 megawatts. And they'd say, oh, you guys are short 26 megawatts. When in fact, no, we're not. We're perfect. We're meeting the target in that hour. Okay, so I'm going to pause there because it's a really important concept. And I see a couple hands up. Looks like a Christian.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates. I want to go back to deliverability for a second, and I would also like to link this to the CAISO's informal comments from December 22nd, where the ISO asked Edison for more specification on how the NQC values would be derived, particularly in light of deliverability variation. I think the example here, it's clear if you have fully deliverable 15 megawatts from the solar facility, but then you start eating into the energy only increments above that 15 megawatts, I think there's a valid question as to what actually is deliverable if you're taking NQCs for much of the reliability contracted fleet that are from those assessment hours at gross and net peak. And then on top of that, you start needing energy only megawatts. How much of that actually is deliverable, particularly when you look at the IRP and basically every portfolio, regardless of the assumptions that you might change, the core of that build out is going to be massive energy only solar. So, what exactly is Edison's response on this question? Because I think we heard from this morning, Bridget's response on substantially the same question as well. We're still going to go with the assumption that if it's deliverable at the peak, those NQCs are deliverable across the day.
Okay, so boy, there's a lot in there, Christian. First, we are not allowing energy-only resources to be part of our RA showing. All of the capacity here that's being showed is associated with deliverable capacity. Okay, so there are no energy-only resources in our capacity showings.
Can I get a clarification on that actually then? Because if this is a solar resource, and if what is the megawatts in your example that is fully deliverable for the solar resource?
I think I've been using 100. Sorry for flipping through pages. Yeah, it was a solar facility, 100 megawatt solar facility, went through the interconnection process, and the ISO told you you're fully deliverable. We'll just shape it based on an exceedance type methodology to be determined. Does that help?
The discount down to NQC of just 15 megawatts is not reflecting if the deliverability is fully captured at 100 megawatts, how are we getting down to 15?
The 15, I think, is coming from some like an ELCC type evaluation that we use for solar today. They interconnected as a 100 megawatt resource. They were studied for deliverability as a 100 megawatt resource, and they passed it. And then after the fact, the PUC has gone through, and again, people that actually do this daily, my expert's not here today, so I may step on things. After the fact, as portfolios change, there's some flavor of ELCC that's done. And right now, I think September was around 15 megawatts for solar. That's where, and the NQC winds up being the ISO's verification of the qualifying capacity limited by deliverability. And if it's fully deliverable, the NQC is going to be the QC. Okay, thanks, Jeff. I think given that response, I would retool my
concern to be making sure that these midday solar megawatt levels, assuming these are fully deliverable, are not inadvertently putting a squeeze on RPS energy that would potentially be energy only and not represented in this example. But back to your response.
Yeah, no, this is good, because the whole dynamic of how energy only resources versus fully deliverable resources sort of interplay on the system is really who's willing to pay the most to produce at that stage if the lines are getting overloaded. I guess the good news is, from a reliability standpoint, if you're counting on 100 megawatts and you got two generators at the same place, they're both 100 megawatts, generator A and B. From a reliability standpoint, we really don't care which one of them is generating. We still get the 100 megawatts. From a reliability standpoint, we really don't care if the fully deliverable guy is generating or the person that was energy only. This is a silly hypothetical where they're at the same place and the lines get overloaded. So that sort of rationing will happen in the market. As long as we can get the 100 megawatts out, kind of doesn't matter that one was energy only and one was fully deliverable. But we're only going to let the fully deliverable person be in our showings. Because
Okay,
we know they're fully deliverable.
Oh, sorry.
Next we have Karen. There's one other quick point I want to make, Carrie, before I go there. We had a conversation with the ISO. We've had a lot of conversations. We are not proposing any changes as part of this proposal to what the ISO does in the interconnection or deliverability study process. We're not proposing changes to that process. I think some people may have felt that we were saying that you're going to have 24 separate hourly deliverability studies. We're not. We're proposing to stick with what we've got. And I think the question of too many units on a line is something that we're going to have to grapple with as time goes on if we start to see that issue. One thing the ISO was concerned about, though, let's just say, back to my hypothetical, that this wind was worth 41 megawatts in the showing, but it's actually 100 megawatt solar, and if they're only looking at hour 18, how do they know how much wind they're getting? I mean, how do they know they're getting 100 megawatts for a must offer? And as part of our showing, you might recall, people are going to have to enumerate every single resource that's part of their showing, and they're going to have to enumerate sort of the capacity back that. How much of that resource are you bringing to the table? So I don't have it here, but if I was bringing 100 megawatts of wind and it was only showing up as 41 megawatts in hour 18, I would still be showing that that resource was a 100 megawatt wind resource, and the ISO would know it was 100 megawatts. The issue really comes up is if they're going to start looking at an hour where after the sun goes down, that hour, like whatever, hour 22, the solar is going to be 0. So if I'm showing 0 from the solar, how do they know it even has a must offer? And the concept is, well, not only do we know what the profile is for every 24 hours, but we have a 25th value, which is actually the portfolio that you're bringing, sort of the megawatt capacity of every resource you're bringing in your portfolio. And the ISO will need to know this, because if they do study an hour where there's 0 for their study purposes, that unit is still on the hook for a must offer. So I think we had good progress with the ISO, letting them know that they will know the whole portfolio. They will know the whole capacity that is being brought, even if the shape of that capacity is 0 in an hour that they're studying. Okay, I see Carrie at the top again.
Hey, Carrie Bentley with Goodwell Consulting. Can we go back to slide 7? On this, I just really wanted to support the idea of harmonizing the deficiency test, and then emphasize something you said, which is you also have to harmonize the load requirements. And today, the LRA provides the planning reserve margin. And I'm wondering, because you're going to have varying hourly planning reserve margins, what what you were thinking. Is it if you're just going to pick whatever the PRM is in the CAISO test hour, and then will the CPUC then validate the other hours, or can you just talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, the idea is that all of the ISOs, all of the showings through the CEC process should stack up to what the ISO's system-wide load is. And so that should be the bogey. And then, yeah, I think technically you're right. We may have different planning reserve quantities in each hour. We're proposing a single percentage. So whatever your load is, there's a fixed percent. That's what the ISO's stacking bogey needs to look like. Now, I think you raised a nuance that I don't think we've considered, that let's just say the PUC says the planning reserve margin is, let's just say 17%, I'm just picking a number, but some other LRA says it's 15. You know, what does the ISO use as its target? I kind of asked the ISO, what do they do today? And I think we're kind of stuck with whatever they do today.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, you know, we'd have a planning reserve margin that took us to the 1 in 10. But maybe can you go back and talk about your proposal, though? It sounded like you said you would do a fixed planning reserve margin for all hours. Is that, I mean, I'll just note that if you want, I also thought you said you were in favor, though, of doing a 1 in 10. And to get it to a 1 in 10 loss of load, by definition, because of exceedance, you'll have a different planning reserve margin in all hours.
Okay, we haven't said 1 in 10. We've said that that's a policy decision that's outside of our proposal, that whatever the policy is for reliability, we'll have to make a planning reserve margin that gets us there. Right now, we're doing planning reserve margin on sort of critical hours to determine, you know, the studies, again, and I wish my person that actually does these things was here. The study sort of pulls out the problem hours and figures out how to fix them as part of the planning reserve study. We're not really proposing we do anything different, at least not in this proposal. This proposal assumes that there was a process to determine the planning reserve margin. However the study was done, along with that planning reserve margin was associated with a policy target of 1 in 10, 1 in 15, 1 in 20, whatever the policy is that the state decides it wants. And then given those constraints, a number pops out. And that number may pop out differently each month, but we proposed we'd use that same percentage for every hour within the month. We would, and you're right, Carrie, you might need a really, really tiny planning reserve margin to cover a 1 in 10 year and one of these hours, and we're just not going there. We don't want to calculate hourly planning reserve margins.
Okay.
And have different values. You could, but that's not our proposal. Okay, I think I've got Kathleen at the top.
Great, this is Kathleen Colbert. Can you go back to slide 7 or go to slide 7? Yes, we can move back.
Sure, yeah.
Back and forth, back and forth. So I understand where this is coming from. I did want to put it out there that one thing that concerns me is that, I should say Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, that this seems to be going in the opposite direction of what CAISO does today for its local assessment, where my understanding is it does it the lower of the historical hourly output for the solar profiles. We'll use that since that's the example, or the NQC. So under current practice, the CAISO would look at this and say NQC is 15 megawatts. And your hourly profile exceeded that. And so we can have assurance that that NQC is a reliable value for that adjusted peak test. Whereas if the hourly profile is below, let's say it was 10 megawatts, the concern there is that the solar profile just doesn't support the NQC and that adjusted peak hour that we're looking at. And that's why I understand it to use the lower of, so it limits it to 10. So we're not over counting towards being able to meet our requirements. I am concerned, Jeff, that this seems to be flipping that and saying an over counting beyond what the reliability value of the asset is. And I just wanted to flag that and also highlight the inconsistency between local so we don't lose that. in the discussion. If that makes sense.
Okay, so, well, I understand part of your points, but we're not proposing any change to the ISO's determination of local. And again, someone can correct me. Each resource only has right now one NQC. They don't have a different NQC if they're going to be counted as a local resources, as composed with a system resource. So we're not proposing any changes to the way the ISO does the local determinations.
So, and that's exactly why I'm flagging for you that this is the inverse of what the CAISO does for its local test on solar. I think that's really important to recognize, because since you're not proposing changes, the CAISO does the lower of in their local test. And if you need, I can share the documentation with you offline if you need it. Thank you.
ISO might want to count on that, but they may need to, again, this may be something that in their processes, if they're checking an hour for local when the sun's down, we think that they should be using, we haven't really had this conversation, but it makes sense to use the profile. And if the profile is, lower than that, their local test should use the profile, not the NQC. I mean, they shouldn't be using NQC anytime the sun goes down, but they do.
My current thinking is I understand why they cap it with the NQC, even if the profile goes above, and would need some more analytics from the CAISO to shift to a different approach like you're showing here.
Okay, well, I'll ask the ISO if they get a chance to comment on that. I'm just going to stick with we're not proposing any changes for local. Okay, Matt.
Hey, this is Matt Barmack from Calpine. I think this is just another way of maybe articulating the point that Kathleen just articulated. And, just generally, I think we're sort of surfacing a lot of reasons that the CAISO and PUC rules ideally should be aligned. But I do think in the near term, if CAISO is only validating a single slice and they kind of do what you're advocating, which is focus on the peak and use the performance of solar at the peak, that's going to be a less stringent test than using ELCC as they do now. Because the whole theory of the current rules is, if you use ELCC and stack up the resources to meet the peak, that portfolio will be reliable overall. But you're sort of proposing that CAISO just focus on a single slice and count the solar. If it's the peak, it will be more generous than ELCC. So potentially a lot of, non-reliable portfolios could pass that test.
I don't see it that way. We're not dictating what hour the ISO looks at. They may choose to look at an hour that is below what the current ELCC value is for solar.
Yeah, I think if they do.
Also, Matt, you've got the planning reserve issue that ultimately comes into this, right? So
yep.
We're going to have our target of what the reliability is, and then we're going to run the analytics to figure out what planning reserve margin gets us there. So if this counting is doing what you're saying, I think it's going to be reflected into the planning reserve margin going higher. So I don't see it. I see it creating a more reliable, more realistic view of what's going on in the system, not a less reliable view.
Well,
but it may change planning reserve.
Yeah, I mean, overall, that may be true for the whole proposal. I'm just focused on the CAISO validation. If it's limited to the peak, and they count the solar more than they do now, that seems problematic. If the single slice they choose to validate when and if this goes live is the net peak, maybe that's less problematic.
Yeah, and it's got to be, the planning reserve margin has got to work with this too. We're not trying to play with numbers and wind up with a less reliable grid. Quite the opposite. We're trying to make sure we maintain reliability better than we're maintaining it today.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I see Partha.
Yep, thanks, Jeff. And maybe I'll start with I'm going back a few conversations, so I apologize. There was a discussion earlier, at least, about the sort of the must offer obligation, and particularly I think there was sort of discussion about UCAP and around about D-rated resources, and this is just my this is my understandings of it, and so I'm hoping that if other people push back, I'd be interested. My assumption was that if there's a D rate of these resources, and when I say D rate, I mean more of from a counting perspective, that you have some sort of, you're lowering it, so you have a gas unit that has a P max, but based on availability, you have a calculation for their UCAP value of 90. It wouldn't mean that we wouldn't have a must offer obligation of 100 is available, but just not from a counting standpoint, from basically a probabilistic standpoint, we're saying this is the value of that resource. And I would think that the same thing would apply for wind, solar, anything if we're using an ELCC or using some other method to derate resources based on expected outcomes, that there would be an expectation of that capacity would be available to us, and we need to have some sort of data to validate that and to understand what those values are. So, but just maybe just go see if you had any pushback on that or had any disagreements.
No, that's how I saw it. I mean, if you were 100 megawatt resources, but you've been down counted to 93, well, even though you only count for 93, you need to offer 100. If you offer less than 100, you're going to count for less than 93. That's how I've understood the UCAP would work.
Yeah, and I'll plan more generically to all resources, but that makes sense. And maybe
Sure.
Maybe following up a little bit on the interconnection discussion, and I'm not the CAISO's interconnection expert, so I'm not. But at least this is one discussion that we've had a lot of discussions internally on, and I think that certainly will be a part of the any CAISO stakeholder process. Will need to focus on these topics, and the questions that Kathleen asked and the questions that you're asking, I think, are right on. And I think that at least, from a fundamental basis, my understanding is, it has to make sense from a reliability standpoint first. If we're counting on solar to charge the batteries, but we're studying them at zero from an interconnection standpoint, that wouldn't make any sense. And so that would be obviously something we'd want to avoid, is to make sure that those interconnection studies make sense based on the needs of the grid and sort of fits in well with sort of whatever's being shown in the PUC studies. But I think the second piece of it, at least I think that we'll need to have a lot of discussion on, is sort of implementation challenges, and what do we really need from an implementation standpoint in order to sort of operationalize the program. So we'll likely have the right people from we'll definitely have the right people from the ISO in our stakeholder process participating for more details, but at least I thought I'd provide that initial color in terms of some of the conversations that we've had in terms of how interconnection might fit in with the slice a day.
And just something, just for sensitivity and to reiterate, we're not part of this proposal. We're not proposing changes in the interconnection process. The interconnection process will probably evolve over time, and we'll be active in that. And importantly, we're not proposing in any way to change the deliverability status of anyone that's already interconnected. So this is, if you're fully deliverable today, you stay fully deliverable under our proposal. Okay, and then I think I see Christian again. Were you done, Partha?
Christian again with.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Christian. It looks like Partha is done. I just don't want to cut him off.
All right, I'll go ahead. And again, I'm with Cal Advocates, and I do think we are going to be thinking really carefully about these larger issues, but I do confess a little confusion, Jeff. So in your example, when you said that the 15 megawatts of the 100 megawatts that's fully deliverable, that 15 reflects some kind of ELCC adjustment, I think actually based on prior workshops, we were under the understanding that there is no ELCC in Edison's proposal, that we have moved on to exceedance. And we had specifically asked at a prior workshop, there was a slide with the phrase hourly ELCC, and we got clarification that just meant a type of exceedance. So if you wouldn't mind, just so we know exactly what it is we're going to be thinking through and commenting on, what is the ELCC role in this example here? and in the proposal.
So this was this was supposed to be comparing how things are done today under the single point process versus how it will be done under the 24-hour slice process. And today at both the PUC and the ISO for solar, sorry solar, we're talking about you, but good examples. Everyone looks at this NQC value. And my understanding is this NQC value is determined by the ISO as the lesser of its QC or its deliverability. And the QC, as I understand today, is for solar is determined through an ELCC calculation. So this is supposed to be talking about how I understand things are done today. Going forward, we can't do it that way. And going forward, we have to have profiles, and we're open to the best way of doing profiles. Some flavor of exceedance is probably what's going to happen, but we're open to however we need to come up with reasonable profiles. And you're right, that whole concept of hourly ELCC, in some ways you may be able to say, well, an hourly profile is the hourly ELCC. It's just a different way of getting at it. But we're really looking at hourly profiles going forward, and not sort of for wind and solar at least, and not this concept of this this NQC that is capped based on some ELCC study. Hopefully it was a long way of saying you're right. This was saying what we do today, and that's not what we proposed in our 24-hour process. We propose profiles.
Thanks, Jeff. I think you've cornered us into the same concern that you and others were saying, which is it will come down to what the CAISO is actually testing for. And I think in the 2020 IPER update, I would just mention the 2023 peak hour, I believe, is an hour ending 20 in September. So I think that's a really serious concern as to how much solar is going to be around there. But I understand this a lot better than I did a few minutes ago. So thank you for answering my questions here.
You're welcome. And yeah, so if we moved to hour 20, it's not really crystal clear here, but yeah, we got like nothing in solar if we're testing hour 20. And that's fine. If the ISO is going to test hour 20, we would give them the solar profile and it would be nothing, in this graph, but they'd also have to use hour 20 load. So they can test any hour they want under this proposal. And truthfully, if we move towards the 24-hour slice proposal, I think the ISO will evolve its processes over time, but initially they can test a single point. We just need to know what it is. Then I think I see Noah. Christian, if you were done, we'll move on to Noah.
Yes, I'm done.
Thank you.
Hey, Jeff, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. I've heard you say Edison's proposal has a singular NQC value. My understanding is that the Gridwell Vistra proposal also has a singular NQC value. I'm wondering whether or not, I think PG&E had a version of a 24 slice proposal as well, but it wasn't clear to me whether or not that was a single NQC value or if it's a different hourly values. I'm wondering if, since we're kind of talking about this topic, I'm wondering if PG&E can chime in on that particular proposal.
Yeah, and just for clarity, we're not proposing anything different for conventional resources. Right, so they have a single NQC, conventional resources have a single NQC today. We're not proposing any changes for those.
Right.
By month, I think.
Yeah, this is Peter Griffiths from Pacific Gas and Electric. Noah, to answer your question, for the most part, we are thinking that there would be a profile for the resources that would essentially map off of a single value. To a large degree, not unlike what Edison is proposing.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then I have one more question. It's Chris. Chris, could I ask you to hold it because I want to make sure I get through this last slide and then I'll jump right back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine, please.
Okay, so we've we've sort of touched about this, that today everything works on a single point, but going forward, there's a lot more information, and sort of under the 24 slice, even under the 2-point proposal, there's more information. Right now, the ISO funnels everything in based on a single data point, and they kind of use it in 2 places. They use it to do their deficiency test. They take those values for deficiency tests, and then I'll say they reverse engineer a must offer requirement from that one number. And since under the 24-hour slice proposal, it depends on what hour you want to look at, the numbers are going to change for anything that's profiled. So there needs to be more precision in the communication, and the ISO needs to be very clear on what it's testing, what hour it wants to test. So we can be very clear to provide them the information they need, both to do their deficiency tests properly. Like again, it's 41 megawatts of wind, not 15 in my hypothetical. And so they still know the whole portfolio and everything that has its must offer. It's not so, you can't just reverse engineer one-to-one because we're using profiles. So I don't think any of this is a showstopper. It's just we're going to need to be very precise in what's communicated between the PUC and the ISO. And the ISO systems are going to have to know what this information means so that they're using it properly, again, both to do their deficiency test and to make sure they know the portfolio that has a must offer and the amount of must offers that portfolio by unit is offering. And we give them all that information. It's all part of our showing. It's just we need to make sure we're all looking at the right information at the right time. Okay, so with that, Chris.
Yeah, well, I was going to comment on a little bit more on the kind of the counting stuff and some of the prior discussions, but I will just say, since we went through this slide as well, I'll just chime in to say I think CAISO does need to consider how to update some of its systems to be able to do this kind of a validation process, and they should be aligned, and the CAISO should be, using this kind of information on more of an hourly basis. If we go forward with this, I think I would, suggest that they should certainly, account for that in their process as well, and goes along with some of the things I put in the chat about updating the CPM approach and those sort of things to stay aligned. So I think I would support this piece of the proposal. I just wanted to make a comment since we're kind of wrapping up in these work group processes, and I've been trying to just observe as much as I can, but and I should say, sorry, this is Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. And I just wanted to note, apologies for the dog. I just wanted to note that, I think I get a little bit concerned with the 24-hourly idea and the use of exceedance methodology and the potential for some false precision or a false sense of reliability or meeting reliability because of it. And I think, it's going to require either a very analytical approach to how you set the exceedance methodology, which I think is a big debatable piece here, or some other type of very analytical approach to how you set some kind of a PRM adder to adjust for the fact that these historical exceedance, outputs will probably differ over time, and they're going to, impact the outcomes of this if load, has an excursion or the production from these renewables have an excursion that goes way away from these normal historical output, that we get from them in these profiles. So that thing, I think, is part of the overall SCE proposal. It seems pretty nebulous to me at this point. I haven't heard a very formulaic approach to how we would either determine the exceedance method level that we would choose, the percentage, or how you would actually do the PRM piece of this. So those are some concerns I have with the SCE proposal. I think any proposal needs to answer those things. So I just wanted to throw that out there just as an overarching part of this discussion, since we're kind of wrapping up the work group process. And I think that could be maybe a detail that we work out later in future, parts of the proceeding, but I think it would require some further discussion at the very least. So that's it. Thanks.
And I will say that we have been nebulous on exactly how we get the profiles. There are some concrete proposals and methodologies out there. Our principle has been something that we think is reasonable, that reasonably represents the conditions, the output under the conditions we're concerned about. And yeah, I think there's a lot of ways we can get there. And the planning reserve margin we've said has to be, first, we have to determine what target of reliability we're shooting for. And then you can test your portfolios based on the profiles we're using, based on the portfolios we have. You can test them to see if they're meeting that level of reliability or not. And then it becomes the planning reserve margin has to be adjusted until you're actually meeting it. So there's a methodology there, but you do have to nail down what your reliability target is. You do have to nail down the profiles, and then you have to test your portfolios. And I kind of see the planning reserve margin as sort of falling out of that. And we're actually talking about a lot of those questions, I think, in the IRP space also, about what is the appropriate planning reserve margin and what is the appropriate reliability standard. And that's part of the reason we felt that was separable from this exact proposal.
Okay.
So I appreciate that.
Well, that's really helpful. I would just say that as part of that, kind of reaction to that is, if we're going to be kind of, using the PRM as an output from some of these other the determinations we're making here in the proposal, I think it's really important to get the right exceedance methodology if we go down this path then. And how to do that, I think, is still up in the air, and that's the part that I have a bit of concern with. And if we're just kind of picking a number out of thin air, that's going to end up resulting in a bad input into that PRM output that we get. So that's my main concern on the exceedance thing. And I guess I don't have a good suggestion for the analytics, but I think there needs to be some more analytical basis for what's the percentage exceedance that we actually pick. And I know we talked about that a lot, but I just wanted to reiterate that, and I'll shut up for now. Thanks for hearing me out.
Thank you. Okay, that's all I had for this presentation.
You want to wrap up? Okay.
Yeah, I'm done. So thanks everyone for the opportunity and comments and questions.
Thanks for making my job very easy. So
Thanks,
we'll hand it to Calpine. Matt?
Hey, sure. Yeah, so should I try to pull up my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
See that.
Okay, let me get this in presentation mode. How about that?
Yep, that works.
Okay. Exactly. Well, first of all, I'm going to take the presenter's prerogative to respond to something that Chris just said before I get into my own presentation. I think Chris identified a really important point, which is, there's all this, there is, in Jeff as well. I mean, there is all this reliability modeling that's going on in IRP. But it's based on sort of a fundamentally different framework or structure than we're really talking about now with the 24 slice approach. And so I don't think that we can just take a planning reserve margin that pops out of that process and sort of graft it on to the 24 slice approach. And so that, I mean, I agree with Chris that sort of that general topic requires a lot more attention. So let me go into my planned presentation. I'm Matt Barmak. I'm Vice President of Market and Regulatory Policy for Calpine, and the one of the main reasons that I signed up to present on this topic was actually to goad Edison and the CAISO into discussing this topic of, how penalties and backstop would work under slice of day. And so I really appreciate Jeff's detailed presentation and the comments that the CAISO has made during the meeting already. And it makes my job a lot easier, because a lot of what I'm going to go over is pretty redundant with stuff that we've discussed. So I'll try to go pretty quickly. And Rhett, I'm going to need, if there are questions, I think I'm going to need your help. So just let me know if there are questions.
Okay, will do.
Thank you. So just, starting off with the status quo, their deficient LSCs currently face two different sets of penalties and backstop costs. So the CPUC penalties that are $8.88 a kilowatt month in the summer, and with the new points system, those can be doubled or tripled. And then there's some potential exposure to CAISO backstop costs, which, without going into the details, those are generally about $6.31 a kilowatt month currently. And, generally what we've observed, at least in recent years, is even this combination is sometimes insufficient to encourage LSCs to completely satisfy the system RA requirements. Some of the last few megawatts that might be necessary to meet system RA requirements in the tightest months are imports, and may actually be more expensive than the combination of penalties and backstop. So just generally, we think it's really important to preserve similar, if not stronger than the status quo incentives for LSCs to meet system RA requirements. So just wanted to talk a little bit about how we think penalties could be applied to, everything that I'm going to say is really about the 24 slice approach on which PG&E and Edison have converged. And, I can walk through these points, but, basically we support, the general approach that Jeff just articulated. So it's important that the penalties encourage LCs to procure for every slice. We're concerned that, if the penalties were prorated, for example, if the current penalties were if LLCs faced 1/24 of the current penalties for deficiency in any slice, then they might not procure for some of the slices that are hardest to satisfy. And then, also it's important that the penalties in combination with backstop provide sufficient incentives for LLCs to pay prices that allow suppliers to recover their costs. So I think the status quo roughly does that. And we think the Edison approach of, sort of assessing penalties based on the maximum deficiency in any slice, sort of roughly preserves the status quo incentives. It would provide sort of the same incentive. Say an LSC is only short in an individual slice. It would provide that LSC the appropriate incentive to cure that deficiency, even if it had to pay the entire cost of a resource just to cure a deficiency in that single slice. And then sort of on the flip side, another approach might be to apply the current penalties separately to each individual slice, and we don't think that's appropriate. That might result in excessive or duplicative penalties if the deficiencies in multiple hours, say, could be cured with the same resource. So in kind of socializing some of our thinking informally before this workshop, one thing that PG&E in particular asked about is what are we proposing with respect to the current point system, and we think that the most straightforward approach is that a point would be accrued for a deficiency in any single slice. So I guess actually that's two points for a deficiency in any single slice in the summer. Rhett or Luke or Peter, I don't know if you want to offer some comments here, because I know you've done some thinking on this topic, or wait till the end.
We can wait till the end.
Okay. I'm not going to go through this simple numeric example because it's very similar to Jeff's graphical example. So then I just also wanted to touch on how we think CPM might work under slice of day, and this has already been discussed pretty extensively in this workshop, but I think there's some pretty significant gaps that will require some attention. So this is based on our very rough understanding from CAISO's comments and from conversations with CAISO, and I invite CAISO to jump in after I present this slide, but we think at least initially, if the 24 slice approach were rolled out, CAISO would probably validate a single slice, and it would correspond to peak load. The concern this raises was something that I flagged just a few minutes ago, which is CAISO may not use CPM to cure LSE deficiencies in slices that it's not validating. So, for example, if an LSE is deficient in the net peak and the CAISO is validating the peak, CAISO might not use CPM to cure that deficiency, and that means that LSEs would have weaker incentives, because they wouldn't face direct exposure to CPM to cure deficiencies in those slices. And those other slices, such as the net peak, are potentially more significant for reliability. So that's a concern. From a reliability perspective, I think CAISO could use other flavors of CPM. For example, it could declare a significant event if it were concerned that the resources that it was being shown by LSEs were not reliable in aggregate. Even though they were sort of okay LSE by LSE based on whatever the ISO was validating. The problem with that general approach is the costs of that kind of CPM procurement maybe socialized inappropriately, and I think Jeff both today and other contexts has talked a little bit about getting around this problem through an approach that would involve the CAISO potentially allocating certain types of CPM costs to LRAs, and then the LRAs somehow figuring out how to allocate those costs to LSEs in a way that is appropriate and reflects which LSEs are actually causing reliability issues. But that I think that probably requires tariff changes that will need to be worked through in this this new process that Partha was discussing. So I think all of this just highlights that it would be really helpful if the CAISO rules and the PUC rules, and the associated assessment of penalties and allocation of backstop costs were aligned. And I'm hearing that everybody sort of wants to move in that direction, but until we get there, we may have a few holes. So that's all I've prepared. I'm very grateful to Edison and CAISO for addressing this topic today as well. And I'll take any questions if there are any, or Rhett, if you guys want to weigh in on how you're thinking about the point system, that'd be great.
I don't see any questions, or maybe I'll turn to Peter on the point system.
Yeah, this is Peter Griffiths with PG&E. Certainly, the penalty structure was something that we thought about and talked about internally, and there were a couple of different options that could be used for setting up the point system or how to assess the points. The Edison proposal really pretty much says if you fail in any single slice, you fail essentially for the entire month, for the entire showing. And that would be one way to do it, and to pretty much keep the point system on that basis. If you wanted to think about doing it another way, you could do it on a slice by slice basis, but that adds more complication, largely because it would require rethinking sort of the penalty structure and how the penalties and incentives were to be aligned. I think PG&E is still thinking about this internally. I think we would probably want to keep it on a monthly basis and not do it on not do the points on a slice by slice basis, but to continue to keep it sort of as it is sort of what our thinking has been. But we did have some internal discussion on that. I don't know if there are questions.
Yeah, and I don't know, Bridget or Partha, if you have any further thoughts on how CPM would work with the 24 slice approach, but this has already been discussed a lot today, so.
No, this is Partha. Do you mind if I'll address your question? I don't have anything else to present here, at least in terms of exactly how it will be framed out. I think you all are asking the right questions. I think the two other pieces that I think we'd have to that we're really sort of focused on is, the harmonization is certainly key, but I think there's implementation will sort of be the other piece, and how the other LRAs fit together. But we certainly have we've done a decent amount of outreach with folks on this, and we've heard that theme, at least in terms of looking for that harmonization between programs, and that certainly will be a key goal of ours as well. So yeah, thanks Matt.
Thanks, Rhett. That's all I have.
Okay, and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or in the queue, so it looks like we're about 10 minutes ahead of schedule, so why don't we take that break and reconvene at 2 o'clock. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Let me just double check that either Scott or Greg is on the line.
Yeah, I'm on. This is Greg.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks, Greg.
Do you want to start presenting, Greg?
Yeah, I'm ready. And
Okay.
do I have, can I share my screen or what?
You can share your screen. Yep, you can share.
Okay. Here, assuming it's here. Multiple windows. There we go. And I'm going to do full page. There we go. All right. That look right, Rhett?
Yep, I can see it.
All right, thank you. Hey everyone. I'm Greg Klatt for Western Power Trading Forum. Today, myself and Scott Murdishoff for Independent Energy Producers Association will be presenting on multi-year RA requirements. And let me just jump right in because we do have a lot to cover. So first, I just wanted to quickly go over the history of multi-year requirements and proposals that have been presented to the Commission over the years. You go back to the earliest days of the RA program, or almost to the very earliest days, and the Commission recognized even that far back that there are probably some real benefits to multi-year requirements. But they just keep on kicking the can down the road is what's happened previously. And so in 2004, in the first decision on the topic, the Commission deferred consideration of proposals because they viewed multi-year requirements as a second generation topic. I think that was the initial resource adequacy policy decision. And then subsequent to that, we did actually get to it in phase 2 of that proceeding, DO5 something. And but it took until 2010 for the Commission to issue a decision. And in that decision, they declined to adopt multi-year requirements based on what I think it's fair to characterize as wishful thinking about existing programs. And I'll get to that in just a minute. I mean, well, I could just say it here. So the Commission assumed that, hey, we have this new RA program, the new in quotes. We have locational marginal pricing at the CAISO, and we have the RPS program, and that should, produce enough capacity and additional capacity. We shouldn't have a problem. As we all know, the 1-year RA timeframe has not been effective at all in incenting new generation. RPS, well, basically everyone invested in solar. At least, that's the lion's share of the new investment has been in solar. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we're here today, the problems that we have today. Then things were kind of muted for years, but there were proposals made periodically in the proceedings after that. And in 2016 and 2017, the Commission again deferred multi-year requirements pending development of a durable, flexible RA construct, which is never happened. So by the end of the third quarter of 2017, the Commission dropped adoption of a durable, flexible capacity requirements program as a prerequisite for multi-year requirements. But then, 9 months later, when the Commission adopted the multi-year local RA program, and this is the initial decision on multi-year, they said that, expansion of multi-year requirements to system and flexible RAs should be deferred due to anticipated changes to the flexible RA construct. I had a couple opportunities subsequent to that where I pointed out to the Commission that effort seems to be stalled. And so finally, in the June 2000 decision, the Commission directed parties to consider expanded multi-year requirements along with the RA restructuring proposals. And that takes us to kind of the crux of things. Why now? Why do we need multi-year requirements for system? And just to be clear, and Scott will talk about, we'll touch upon this also, but the the focus of our proposal is for system requirements. That really seems to be where the problem is now. Flexible, not so much. So the idea would be to go ahead and implement multi-year requirements for system RA, and then not do that for flex. Flex is going to be procured on a multi-year basis as part of the local capacity that Edison and PG&E are procuring through the CPE program, and then also flexible attributes will be picked up through the system procurement. So we don't think that's a problem right now, and we don't need to address it. But here, let's talk about why now. First and most importantly, from a WPTF perspective, is to multi-year requirements for system RA can help prevent premature retirement of critical reliability resources. And why is that? Well, the thermal generators have been saying this, till they're blue in the face. We need predictable revenue streams over a multi-year period in order to safely invest in needed maintenance. And not only that, there's the potential for those type of revenue streams to support efficiency upgrades. That's another way of saying that is, we may not be in the problem that we found ourselves in 2000 with the outages in August if we had multi-year requirements up to that point. Another benefit of multi-year requirements, and this has been touched upon in proposals in the last proceeding, D19 whatever, 1109 or whatever it is. So the last RA proceeding, I think it was either CAISO or PowerX proposed seasonal requirements for the summer. The point being is that as we see supply tightening across the West and we see increasing retirements in the Northwest, we have RPS requirements now that are being put into place, and also greenhouse gas requirements. So supply, we can't assume that all the imports that we've been relying upon for the past decade, that they'll continue to be available in the volumes that we have seen previously. So to help ensure against that tightening supply across the West, you lock in these critical resources in reasonable timeframes to help us bridge the gap to get to the clean energy future that we're all working on. Another thing about multi-year requirements can help provide clear investment signals for incremental capacity. This touches upon, in part, the efficiency upgrades. And the idea there is to reduce reliance on reactive procurement directives like we've seen over the last couple of years coming out of the commission, because they've had to, because the capacity hasn't been there. And then lastly, to facilitate the orderly retirements of resources as new resources come online. And this is something that I know a lot of stakeholders are concerned about. We don't want to make investments in resources that are very marginal. We don't necessarily want them for the next 40 years, but every forecast, every modeling scenario has basically, almost everyone has shown that, we need the gas fleet to be around as we're making this transition. But the counterpoint to that is, if we have multi-year requirements and there are still resources that don't get multi-year contracts, that might signal that those resources are, really are no longer needed. Now, there's a lot of different moving parts around that, so I don't want to go into too much detail and make too definitive of statements, but we see that as one of the other potential benefits that might address some of the concerns of other parties. And just quickly, before I hand it off to Scott, I wanted to, if I can, share something else here. My little cliff notes on that decision in 2010, and they're set up as kind of a point counterpoint in the decision itself, and I have paraphrased them here a bit for the benefit of making it a little bit shorter. So one of the pros that the commission recognized at the time was multi-year requirements can provide advanced knowledge of impending reliability problems, and thereby allowing planners to address the problems in a more timely and cost-effective manner. The counter to that was, well, it may not be necessary to have multi-year requirements for RA because we have these programs. I touched upon this at the beginning when I was speaking. We have the RA program, we have the locational marginal pricing, and we have the RPS program. That obviously has not worked out. A second benefit that the commission recognized was that it could stimulate merchant investment instead of relying solely on commission-directed forward procurement by the utilities. This is the OBO on behalf of procurement. The counter to that is, as the commission saw, was as a practical matter, LSCs will need to make long-term commitments even without a regulatory obligation. Well, again, we've seen how that's played out because the investment's all going to solar, which is a big part of why we're here today, trying to come up with a restructured RA program. Third, promote competition between new and existing resources, competition between transmission upgrades and generation supply additions, in theory, yielding more cost-effective outcomes. And then the counter was, well, we have, if we have a stable market environment with transparent price signals, that'll provide adequate incentives for investment. That has not happened. And one of the biggest disruptors of this stable market environment has been these reactive procurement directives by the commission. And from an LSC perspective, and this has been a big concern of the ESPs. It's now also a concern of the IOUs, is that if we're making investments and then the commission issues a procurement directive and suddenly this investment that we've been looking at, the economics might be impacted significantly by this procurement directive, this emergency procurement directive, for example. So that stable market environment has not manifested, and in part it's because of these. Before the emergency reliability proceeding, there were one-off procurement directives and things like that. So it hasn't played out like the commission thought it would play out. Another benefit is more cost-effective backstop procurement decisions. The counter to that, and the commission said, was, well, there's a possibility that year-ahead RA obligation will provide adequate incentive for merchant development. Obviously, that didn't happen. And then lastly, the pro was ensure all market participants equally shoulder the burden of investment in new resources. And the commission said, well, yeah, but the counter to that is multi-year requirements are more difficult for ESCs to comply with. That is still the case, and that's something that we need to wrestle with. ESPs do represent a significant portion of the load, or serve a significant portion of the load in California. They're not going away. So in looking at multi-year requirements, we acknowledge that we have to give some attention to how to make this palatable for ESPs. The counter to that, is that ESPs and everyone else has been stuck with these procurement obligations that have arisen in part because we didn't have multi-year requirements in the past. So now you're looking at having to make 10 to 15-year investments, whereas that might not have been the case if we had multi-year requirements all along. Anyhow, with that, I will turn it over to Scott. Let me make sure I can exit the screen share. Yeah, here we go. All right, Scott, over to you. Scott?
Yeah. So is everybody seeing the presentation?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I'll just start with a quick overview of multi-year requirements in a couple of other jurisdictions. First, I'll start with PJM, which has a 3-year forward requirement, and their requirement is set to 100% of peak load. That is higher than what various parties have proposed in the past in previous iterations of the RA program here in California. Now, obviously, with such a long forward requirement and setting it at 100% of peak load, you do need to have processes in place that allow for some revisions and adjustments to the peak load forecast and allow for resources to respond to those changes or to substitute if somebody's exiting the market, for example. So PJM has what are referred to as incremental auctions, and they hold these at 20 months, 10 months, and 3 months ahead to enable those kinds of revisions and adjustments. And similarly, the New England ISO also has a 3-year forward requirement set to 100% of peak load. They call the auctions that occur during the intervening period from the initial forward capacity auction up to the delivery year as reconfiguration auctions. And they have 3 of those that occur annually up until 3 months before the commitment period or the delivery year. And then after that, there are monthly reconfiguration auctions that occur from 2 months prior to the start of the commitment period and then continue on through most of the commitment period. And that's a little confusing to try to explain in words or to maybe visualize how all those processes sort of interact. So I put together this other slide where I took a visual from the ISO New England website that just kind of lays it out more in a calendar form. And what they call the delivery year is the capacity commitment period. So you see that down at the bottom, that long continuous orange band that starts in June of one year and then ends in May of the following year. The forward capacity auction up at the top is 3 years and a couple of months before that. And then you have those annual reconfiguration auctions occurring each year thereafter. And then starting in April of the delivery year, you have the monthly reconfiguration auctions, and the green is a monthly bilateral process so that the suppliers are free to either go through the centralized market or just negotiate bilaterally. It's important to acknowledge, though, that the way that multi-year forward requirements are implemented and the implications of the multi-year requirements are very different in these jurisdictions because they are centralized capacity markets rather than the bilateral market construct that we have here in California. So load migration is less of an issue in those other jurisdictions because the RTO is basically the counterparty. It's the RTO's contracting for the supply, and although the capacity is procured 3 years ahead, the costs are then allocated to LSEs based on actual load shares. I believe during the actual delivery year, at least that is the case for PJM as I understand their materials that describe the program. And I'm not sure about exactly how that happens in New England, but the main point being that for the LSEs, they really don't have to worry so much about either entering into contracts for the capacity itself or how the 3-year ahead requirement affects them as they get closer to the actual delivery year. So those other jurisdictions do have these periodic auctions that allow for fine tuning. Like I said, that means either that the RTOs or the ISO can adjust the forecasted peak load, but also that suppliers can swap obligations with each other, buy and sell their commitments. And in a bilateral market, those kinds of risks of both changes in the peak load forecast and load migration or suppliers maybe not being able to meet their obligations that they thought they'd be able to meet 3 years ahead. All of those need to be managed more directly by the LLCs and suppliers. So let me then talk about what Greg and I kind of brainstormed some of the key barriers or objections and the implementation issues that might need more time to hash out. So it seems that some parties could be concerned that the net qualifying capacity values of resources will change over time. I mean, we've obviously seen the NQC values for some resources change pretty significantly, but as long as we have a regular process in place to reevaluate the whatever the resource counting methodology may be, the exceedance values or the ELCC values, they're unlikely to change that much in over a 3-year time frame. And even to the extent that they do change, the PUC's rules could acknowledge kind of a lock-in, basically honoring those NQC values over the full multi-year requirement period. And so that, for example, if 2022 is the procurement year for capacity procured from 2023 through 2025, those NQC values would be basically respected out through the end of 2025. But of course, they could change then for subsequent years at the time they were procured. Peak and net peak loads may change over time, both with respect to the timing, but also just to the absolute values of those peaks. And to be clear, like the residual auctions in the other jurisdictions allow for, it would be important that whatever load forecast is used to set the 3-year ahead or so requirement ahead of time, that there would be adjustments made at least 1 year out. Those forecasts are likely to be more accurate as they get closer to the delivery year. So there could be adjustments to the requirements that the LSEs actually have to meet. They shouldn't be locked in 3 or more years ahead of time. I think one of the biggest challenges probably is the load migration issue. And this is something that Greg talked about, that the PUC seemed to be concerned with in the 2010 decision. So we haven't had a lot of time to think about this in too much depth, but it seems like the market participants could converge around some solutions. For example, developing contract language that becomes fairly standard that would facilitate assignments of the capacity under contract. And this would be particularly simple, I think, when it's a question of one LSE wanting to sell some of its capacity to another LSE with a comparable credit rating. We may need to have some 2 or 3 standardized approaches that would deal with higher risks to suppliers if one LSE is trying to sell its capacity to an LSE with a lower credit rating. So that is an implementation detail that we need to think more about. You can also address this by revisiting an idea that we've talked about before, which is allowing for LSEs to trade their RA obligations. So this would leave the actual contracts with suppliers intact, and they wouldn't be required or asked to reopen those contracts. It would just be the LSEs kind of swapping those obligations with each other. All right, so let's get to what exactly IEP and WPTF are proposing for these multi-year requirements. There seems to be some aversion at the CPUC to impose multi-year requirements on flexible, because the flexible RA program may be more likely to change more significantly once we get the slice of day kind of framework locked in. That will be more settled for system. So for now, we would expand multi-year requirements to system, and we can go back to flexible RA if we think that it's necessary. Greg also suggested that a lot of flexible RA will be locked up with system and local, that it will be bundled with system and local procurements. So we may not really need to have a multi-year requirement specific to flexible. We would say that at a minimum, the forward requirement is 3 years. There have been parties like IEP in the past who've suggested going up to 5 years. Although the trade-off there is that the forecasts are more likely to be to change more significantly, and load migration becomes a bigger issue. But sticking with the 3-year requirement as an example, for year 1 and 2, we would say that the obligation should be 100% of the peak plus PRM. And year 3 is, I think, TBD. The higher, the better. If it's much less than 100%, then the benefits of sending the scarcity signals, of potentially incentivizing new build, of sending signals about the maybe lack of need for resources that are on the margin, you lose all of those benefits, much less than 100%, and you really don't get much out of that forward requirement. We can resolve some of these implementation details in tracks 2 and 3 of the current proceeding, and we would like to try to target a multi-year requirement for 2024 to 2026 compliance. I mean that the obligation would need to be in place for procurement in 2023. All right, and this is the last slide. So Greg and I were thinking about how an RA program with expanded multi-year requirements might interact with IRP. It seems regardless what happens with RA, you need to have IRP to establish the need to do the longer term forecasting and think about whether resources with certain attributes might be needed in the longer term. There are proposals that IRP would set LSE-specific GHG caps. That's, to be clear, not IEP or WPTF's proposal, but that can still be a function that's housed within IRP. Multi-year requirements of 3 years or more can then take over responsibility for incentivizing new build, rather than having that come through sporadic procurement orders coming out of IRP. So then you'd have an annual cadence and expectations for LSEs. And then as an alternative to the LSE-specific GHG caps, GHG limits could also just be enforced via the RPS program by adjusting the RPS requirements, or as potentially moving over to a clean energy standard that recognizes all zero GHG energy, which would be more closely aligned with the way that SB 100 was phrased with respect to the 2045 target. All right, that's the end of our presentation.
Okay, thanks, Scott and Greg. Looks like we have one question from Kathleen, or she's in the queue. Kathleen?
Sure, yes. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. A couple reactions, and I think one question, but first I want to say thanks for the presentation. Some really interesting background and context that I think is helpful. I mean, I'm comfortable going so far to say that Vistra really supports this proposal, and think that there's a lot of value to multi-year requirements. One of the elephants in the room that I think it was brought up in the chat, but I wanted to bring it up in the conversation, is that, you know, and I think it's something that we had talked about early on in the workshops about, let's recognize some realities about what is happening in our RA commercial space right now. We already have multi-year requirements for system that are procured through the central procurement entity. And I just want to go so far as to put that out there and say that, and if you go to the last, or stay here, because I think you have the 3 year, is that I think what you're proposing is much more modest than the flexibility that the central procurement entities have for procuring these multi-year system attributes, where they can do it for more than 5 years. Granted, it's a higher burden, right, when they do their advice letter, but that can go well beyond 5 years. And so I just wanted to make sure that we level set a bit across the group that a 3 year proposal is much more modest than even the flexibility given to resources that are procured under that CPE. So I see this proposal as narrowing the gap on some concerns I have as to whether or not we're like discriminating against resources outside of the CPE that are being procured because they're not eligible for these longer term contracts for system, local, and any flex with them. I don't see it as fully putting them on the same playing field, but this does a huge amount of benefit to moving us closer towards an RA framework that is less discriminatory between those two. So I wanted to highlight that and thank you for bringing this forward.
Yeah, one of the ironies of all this is that there was a time when PG&E was the main proponent for multi-year requirements, and during one of the periods where there were proposals, and then there was another period where it wasn't PG&E, it was Edison and SDG&E. And I think one of the big concerns at that time among the IOUs was, hey, we have these other LSEs leaning on our procurement, and that's not fair. This needs to be equitable. Well, now we're in a situation where, you know, it is. We have lots of LSEs, not just less than a dozen. We have 50 something LSEs, and we have the CCAs making a lot of investment, but up to date, it hasn't been investment in the type of resources that were needed. So this is a way, you know, at this point, it's kind of like, if we had done this a ways back, a lot of the problems that we're trying to wrestle with now wouldn't have manifested. But beyond that, this is, to your point, Kathleen, this is a pretty modest proposal. You know, arguably the requirement should be 5 years, and it should be 100% for at least 4 of those 5 years. And we should have a centralized capacity clearing market. We don't have a centralized capacity clearing market not for lack of effort on our part to have one. But the commission wasn't ready for that. And CAISO has also been a proponent of multi-year requirements, but there was a time where it was understood that those can really go hand in hand, probably should go hand in hand, to help address the concerns in part that ESPs had about, hey, we don't have that load certainty. We need to make some way to very liquid market to deal with this. But then the CAISO was like, well, no, we don't want to do it. We don't want to run the market. So here we are. So we're coming in with, again, what we think is a modest proposal that there are ways to contract around some of the issues. And Scott and I were kicking this idea around like, hey, why don't, one of the concerns for assignment from a supplier's perspective is we don't want our contract offloaded to an LSE that isn't as creditworthy as the LSE with which we originally contracted. And well, how about if the other LSE has the same credit rating as the entity that you contracted with? Maybe just put that into the contract. Hey, if it has the same credit rating, it's, assignment's not a problem. That's just one small example, but we think there are probably ways that market participants can adjust to 3-year requirements. And also, we, in prior proposals, the third year, what the percentage was, those were political numbers or politically derived numbers. They were compromises. They were like, well, no one's going to have a stomach for 100%. So what can we shave it down to? And we recognize that may need to be the case still in this context. But really, if you don't have a very high requirement for year 3, to Scott's point, you kind of dilute one of the major benefits of this whole construct, which is to ensure that the critical reliability resources that we're going to need for the foreseeable future have the revenue certainty to make investments in maintenance and potentially upgrades. And then also, I'm glad we're talking about UCAP today because, hey, if you have that revenue stream and you can make those investments, then UCAP becomes less of a concern because you're going to be, I'm not advocating for UCAP, just to be clear, but it becomes less problematic to some degree potentially. Sorry, Scott, anything else? Was talking a lot there.
I think we're at time.
Oh, we can go to 2:40. I think we can.
Oh, okay.
Go through
All
that.
right.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess Peter also had his hand up.
Yeah, this is PG&E, Peter Griffiths with PG&E, and I guess I'm a little. I think I understand the argument for.
So we're getting a lot of feedback from somebody. Maybe Greg, are you also on the phone and your computer, or somebody?
No, I'm muted, so not me.
Is it still there or not? It may not still be there. Okay. No, I'm going to say, I guess I certainly can see an argument for having some greater certainty, but I also see the argument for where that might get us into some problems, particularly if we had a 3-year requirement and we're locking in, say, ELCC values for a fairly long period of time, that if those values essentially don't match what the reliability need is, as we saw in August of 2020, then we're essentially not giving ourselves enough options to be able to solve the types of problems that arose in August of 2020, when there wasn't a need essentially to meet the peak demand, but there was a need essentially to meet the net peak demand. And so as we're transitioning essentially the fleet away from on-demand units to renewable units, going to a multi-year forward, it seems introduces potential risks of essentially not being able to be adaptive enough essentially to be able to make the changes that appear that we need. Can you address some of that? Also, there's the question to some degree is, why should the PUC be the only one going to a multi-year forward requirement when the rest of the market, namely the non-PUC jurisdictionals, are not going to a multi-year forward market? The ISO has never advocated going to a multi-year forward RA for all of the LSEs. They certainly have advocated it for the PUC LSEs to do that, but not for all of its LSEs. So can you address that question as well?
Scott, why don't I take the second one first, and you can talk about ELCC, because whenever I get into ELCC, I start getting worried that I'm not accurate. So on the second one, it's a political issue, right? There's the other the munis, the large munis and stuff probably should have multi-year requirements, and but there's only so much we have no control over that. And so I guess it comes down to, well, it's not fair. Well, life isn't fair, of course it's not fair, but we can do what we can do. We can do our part as CPUC jurisdictional LSEs, as advocates, as being the policy space that occupies most, by large, the largest share of the demand landscape, the energy sector. So let's do what we can here, and DWP is going to do what DWP is going to do, unless there's some way to address that in Sacramento and/or through FERC.
Well, to some degree, you're just incenting to some degree LSEs to move out of the PUC jurisdictional realm, and that certainly is a possibility. And we see certainly the likelihood of that happening going forward. So that's probably one concern that I personally have about that, is that you are providing an incentive with the dual treatment for essentially getting out of the PUC jurisdiction. But I understand that for the most part the PUC does have the lion's share, and it does makes sense to have the lion's share have this type of requirement if it's a good idea.
Yeah, and then well, I think Noah just put a comment in the chat that that said what I was largely going to say, which is about the NQC values, is that part of some of the other proposals on the resource counting workshops that came out of those workshops is that we should be refreshing those values on a more regular basis, annually, ideally. And if we're doing that, then we won't have this lag between attributed capacity value and actual capacity value. And they're just, like I said, I don't think they're going to change that much in a 3-year time frame. And one thing that I didn't say during the presentation, but Greg and I were talking about this as we were putting the presentation together, is that we already have 5-year forward requirements. That's what IRP does. It just did. Greg kind of alluded to that, but that's based on going out to 2026 from a 2021 decision. So a 3-year requirement doesn't seem like, it's not really that inconsistent with current practice. It's just that you no longer have to differentiate between incremental and existing.
Yep, and Scott Olson asked about, with that IRP procurement mandate, do we really need multi-year requirements when we have all this new resources coming online? Well, first of all, they haven't come online yet. We're assuming that they will. Hopefully they will, but they may not. So we need at a basic level, just let's keep these other plants around while this new stuff comes online. And then with the 3-year requirement, again, it's a modest time frame. We're all kind of getting used to dealing with longer timeframes now that everyone has been forced into the IRP arena and into that paradigm. And so as these resources come online, yeah, there will be some thermal units that may no longer be needed. That will be signaled as we get closer to those resources coming online, or as they come online. The resources that are less desirable and less able to compete will not be getting contracts, and they will be retiring in an orderly fashion as the new resources come online. At least that's how I envision it. That's how I understand it. That's the most, in my view, that's the most plausible scenario for how this will play out. Conversely, if we don't have multi-year requirements, we may be losing some large chunks of capacity in the next couple of years, the next 5 years. And there may be issues with some of the new resources coming online. And by the way, we're in the middle of or at the beginning of a unique experiment that's never been conducted before, which is having reliability rely upon inverters and batteries and not mechanical resources with the inertia and all that. So let's see how the voltage support plays out. People say it's not a problem. People who are much more savvy about engineering than I have said, well, we can fix that. Well, why don't we make sure we can deal with that before we get rid of what has been historically the backbone of the energy supply and the grid.
Hey, Greg, wanted to call on Kathleen since we're at time, but maybe she can ask her question.
Yeah, if you don't mind if I could share one more. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just also wanted to throw out that while you didn't connect this to a principle, I see this as really important towards meeting principle 1, to balance ensuring a reliable electrical grid with minimizing cost to consumers. So I wanted to tie it to the principle that this is furthering. And I also wanted to know, we're talking a lot about benefits of keeping resources online, but another really important benefit in minimizing the cost to consumers is that these longer term contracts allow for better value to be provided to minimize those costs. And so really just encourage folks not to lose sight that this is probably the biggest proposal to further the goal of that principle 1 of minimizing costs, in my opinion. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kathleen.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have anyone else in the queue or questions. I think we can go to Paul Nelson. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
All right, hoping people can see my screen and hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm Paul Nelson, consultant for the California Large Energy Consumers Association. And let's see here. And just a little bit of background for people who may not know who CLECA is it's an organization of large high load factor customers located in California, and all of the members participate in the base interruptible reliability DR program. And BIP was used to maintain grid reliability 7 times in 2020, once this year. It's also a very significant portion of demand response fleet. And the CLECA members make up a very significant portion of the base interruptible program. So we have a very strong interest in demand response programs, and we support accurate load measurement, and we also support removal of non-performing customers because we want to maintain BIP reputation. Now, to give you a sense of what a CLECA member might be, cement is an industry. Air gas products such as making oxygen, beverages manufacturing, beer, things like that, food packaging, steel processing. So that kind of gives you an idea of what types of industries make up CLECA. So why I'm here today is that we need accounting proposals for all resources. And the California Energy Commission's February workshop report and the process they've done to date is going to be focused on an interim methodology for the 2023 RA compliance year. It will not address the slice a day. And unfortunately, we don't really have a timeline of when the CEC would start a slice a day discussion and do a recommendation. And so I'm here today to try to make sure that we don't have a gap that would cause a delay in a rollout for the RA 2024 year. DR is a bit unique in that the counting requirements need a very long lead time. In April of this year, we'll start the process of counting, of doing re-estimates of demand responses ability. They're due in April of this year. And so they really need to know actually almost a bit more than a year in advance of stuff that gets finalized. So if there's going to be a change to how DR gets counted, they actually need to know it by the end of this year so that they can make filings in April of 2023 to be implemented for 2024. So this, I'm not trying to work around the CEC workshop process. I mean, if they can work on this and incorporate it in a future commission decision, this can be a proposal that can be discussed for future proposals, or if they want to make changes to the long term. But I'm trying to address, you know, what I see as a gap right now to make sure that we don't get 2024 delayed because we don't have a proposal that counts for DR. I think this is a lot of recap, which you've discussed already. Is we're moving away from a single point, annual and monthly number into multiple numbers. And therefore, what we're going to need is an expected hourly load reduction values for a defined slice. Oh, I mean, I forgot to mention, I put a slide. I've revised this particular slide that was sent out in the package for today. And at the end of the meeting today, I will send this out to the group. I've revised this slide a little bit. And then I'll show some examples of why I think the single monthly values that they're currently today are going to be incompatible with the slice of day design, and it would result in either under or over procurement in particular slices. There's pretty much the slice of day proposals have sort of coalesced around two proposals, the 24 by 12 months. And under that proposal, many parties support using the exceedance approach for wind and solar to develop those hourly expected values. And then the 2-point, which is a peak and net peak for each month, the proponents are recommending the use of effective load carrying capability for use limited rate resources. And that would be a single number used for both the peak and the net peak, except for solar, which would then assume a 0 for the net peak. That's my understanding. But I think the point is both options require values that capture value or capability of a resource in that particular slice. So you've all seen this, thing for the 24. And if I'm going to look at DR, it's probably going to be a resource, and you're going to want to be able to use it around, the peak here we have on this graph. Somewhere maybe around hour ending 17 to hour ending 21 is where you'd want to utilize DR and to fit that response under that shape. So what I'm proposing is similar. I guess it's somewhat similar to what wind and solar. You're going to have a profile that's based on the expected load reduction for that DR program. And what can be used now, because we already have, and that expected value, excuse me, back up, that expected value should incorporate performance and weather variation of the DR program. So, however, not all DR programs are weather sensitive. There are some that, such as the industrial programs, that have very little weather variation. But the AC cycling can be very, definitely have weather variations and time of day variations. And the regressions that are here that support the load impact protocols can be used. And the advantage of that is that they're already vetted by the CPUC, and they do produce hourly values, which I'll show here in a moment. Now, that doesn't say that other programs, I mean, I know some of the third parties don't particularly like the load impact protocols, but if they want to propose something that can provide those hourly values and incorporate, that performance and weather variation and propose, different approaches, that's something that they could also then, comment on and bring forth in a process. And so here's an example what I have. I used Southern California Edison's with their summer discount plan, which is an AC cycling program. And this is the load response for from a 4 to 9 p.m. call for demand response. And you can see that the hourly values change quite a bit. You know, it starts off at 28 megawatts at the beginning of the call and goes down to about 12 megawatts at the end of the call. And so my proposal is that's what you would sort of use is the results of like this to be able to use in that resource stack for the 24-hour counting. I do want to point out that there are other calls are available. You might change this to maybe an hour ending 16, or perhaps you want to push it back an hour. And I'll get into some discussions a little bit later about when is this DGAR call window performed. So if we go to the 2-point slice a day, my proposal is a little bit different, but we still need a value for one value for the peak and another value for the net peak. And as I mentioned before, the existing method, which is the average of that 4 to 9 p.m. call window, and I'll back up, which is basically it's a simple average of the 4 to 9 p.m. call period. Or what some people are suggesting is using single monthly effective load carrying capability values is going to result in either under or over procurement at the time of the peak or the net peak. And I've got an example to show this is I've sort of created this hypothetical demand response program with the hourly impact values in yellow. And I've, the 128 megawatts is sort of the simple average of the values that surrounded in the box that's outlined. And then what I've sort of done came up as a proxy ELCC value by taking the weighted the hourly impacts weighted by its relative loss of load expectation. And where I got the relative loss of load expectation was a study that the CAISO published last year for demand response for the year 2020. And so this gives you an idea of when the most likelihood of a loss of load event. In this case, it's hour ending 19, sort of almost, it's in between the peak and the net peak. I picked net peak because that's hour ending 20. It seems to be about the right spot, though some may argue it perhaps should be hour ending 21. And that ELCC proxy is 115 megawatts. But if we compare it to looking at trying to come up with a resource stack at the peak, well, that says, well, maybe we don't have enough resource. I actually got to go out and procure more. What in fact, you can actually provide, almost over 100 more megawatts than what either the average or the ELCC value is doing, the single point number. And that gives you the improper signal that maybe you need to go out and get more resources, which leads to over procurement, which leads to higher bills, which upset my customers and my clients. But I think more critically for a lot of the issues of reliability concerns, it's very alarming what happens in the net peak period. Is you're assuming it can provide 128 or 115 megawatts, but in fact, at that hour, it's only providing 20. And that kind of has a problem because you're not really getting that signal to go out and get a resource that can provide more capacity at the later part of the period, where you might be concerned about the net peak. But again, if I was going to use, again, an hourly profile with my hypothetical, I would apply the 250 to hour ending 18 if that's the peak, and 20 megawatts the net peak. And now I've got my resource capability aligned with the load at that time period that it can do. Let's see. So one of the issues is, what should we do for the capacity shape for DR to meet load? Do you optimize DR to meet a system need requirement or the LSC's load shape? If the system reliability is optimized, then DR call would be based on perhaps a defined call window, which currently is about 4 to 9 p.m. But that call window would probably need to be changed as the resource mix changes the distribution of loss of load expectation, or as load changes over time. The other option is let the load serving entity optimize their DR capability to their own load shape and resource mix. And so perhaps we've got a load serving entity that has a lot of commercial load from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and they've got AC cycling that they could optimize their own load shape, which may not be it wouldn't be a 4 to 9 p.m. Perhaps it's a 2 to 5 p.m. I think those are issues the commission needs to address and make a decision on it. But those are two issues that are going to come up in this discussion. And then just to kind of find out for people who are not familiar with the load impact protocols, it produces expected hourly load reductions based on historical event and test performance data. So the data that's used in prior events gets incorporated. The weather assumption is a 1 and 2 monthly peak, and they currently specify a DR call window from 4 to 9 p.m. But I do want to note caution that while they've assumed a 4 to 9 p.m. call window, there's some programs that can actually be called outside these hours and for longer durations. For example, the base interruptible program is actually a program that's available 24/7, and it can be called up to 6 hours per day. And then these hourly load impacts are based on a 50 percentile performance measurement. And as I mentioned already, the advantage of trying to use something we already have today to get this implemented by 2024, as if these approaches have already been vetted and adopted by the Public Utilities Commission. Before I take questions, I would like to thank everyone, since this is the last workshop. I know a lot of people have spent a lot of the last months doing a lot of hard work, developing proposals and presenting, and I want to thank everyone for doing that and presenting ideas for discussion purposes and for the commission to consider. And then I want to really especially shout out to all the facilitators to help manage these workshops. And also, I've got to then also vote Barbara Barkovich, one of my colleagues. He's doing a note-taking task on this, so that there's a very good record of what was discussed. So I guess now I can go to questions.
Hi, Paul. This is Lisa Wan from PG&E. I'm going to take over facilitation role.
Okay.
I am looking for hands and I don't see anything, and I'm going to double check the chat.
Well, I've either wowed people or they, I'll go with that.
All right, so I do not see any hands, and I'm going to just give folks maybe another 5 seconds in case anyone's shy. And then if not, thank you so much, Paul, for that. Oh, wait. We got a shout out for Barbara. Okay, so Paul, I think that wraps it up for CLECA, unless you have anything else. Oh, we have Doug Carpa. Doug, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think that's unmuted now. Hey, Paul, this is Doug Carpa from Peninsula Clean Energy. I know there's a lot of urgency around the 2024 date, and I am curious whether your calculus would change if things were delayed to 2025. Given, I think a lot of stakeholders have expressed that, wow, we've got a lot of work still to do, and getting everything stood up and like all the necessary analyses done on that time frame may be too ambitious. And I'm curious if you had any reactions to that notion.
As a former project manager, to try to keep something. Well, I'm getting some echo back. As a former project manager who tries to keep something on track, I mean, at this point, I'm not willing to admit defeat that we can't do 2024. I mean, if we admit that we can't do it now, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, there's definitely work that can be done, but the events from 2020, and making sure reliability, the current RA program needs fixing, and we need to fix it soon. And so I'm not an advocate of admitting defeat right now to say, oh, it needs to be 2025. I think we can work forward. Maybe we have to identify, maybe there's things we can identify to go, okay, yeah, there's some elements that need further development, but maybe we can do something now and then phase in, certain items. I mean, I think one of the issues I know that was part of the decision was the hedging issues in contracting, but that's a separate issue from reliability. And so I think the issue, that's an easy one to say, okay, we haven't dealt adequately with the commission's concerns in the hedging proposals, but we can defer that to 2025, period. And so what items can we actually get together to make these changes? Because, my clients want reliability, manufacturing goods with, 5 days of rotating of outages, and for the air gas guys right in the middle of a COVID pandemic, was, not, it was not good. It was not good. So. Anybody else? Questions? Or Doug?
No, that sounds quite reasonable. I think some of on the as an LSE and looking at the contracting that we would have to even if we changed everything by the end of the year, meeting requirements under a new regime by 2024 gets challenging. But I appreciate the sentiment of like, yeah, we can get this all done. Let's shoot for that, and if we fall short, then we do. But if we make it, that's awesome. So.
If we can make it, that's great. I mean, and I think every people who represents a load serving entity wants this changed, and wants this implemented as soon as can, because that brings reliability to the customers, who are paying right now with rates top dollar for electricity. And and the risk to subject them to another 2020, it's not fair to the customer.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Paul. I don't see any other hands, and I don't see anything else in the chat, but we are also at time, so this is perfect. Thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation.
Thank you for making time for this last minute proposal.
Okay, so this is now the Q&A section. We added some more time to make sure for folks who had questions but didn't have time earlier to address them, this would be a good time to ask the presenters. So I'm going to give folks a few minutes to raise their hands, get their questions in, and then we can get that portion of our meeting going. And just to confirm, can folks hear me? Or are we just out of questions?
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Just making sure. Okay, so it seems like everyone's questions have been answered and we've solved everything. Okay, so I'm going to give it another minute, and then in the meanwhile, I'm going to pull up our next step slides. Oh, wait, we have a hand. Chris.
Yeah, hi, Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I guess this is, somewhat of a next step question, but I guess, is there going to be some recording within these work group reports that we do from this that kind of identify areas or recommendations that still need to be further detailed and fleshed out. Specifically, is there like a section for that envisioned in these work group reports? Because I just fear that we haven't really been able to get into the level of detail that's really necessary to implement some of these issues and aspects of these proposals. If there's any thought on that, I mean, maybe that does just tie into the next steps, but if PG&E or SCE or others have any reaction to that, I'd appreciate it. And I guess that would just be my recommendation as well, would just be to do something along those lines in the ultimate work group report. And I just bring it up here because I realize that we're, wrapping up these workshops for the RA reform effort, and it kind of moves into a more formalized process at this point. And I would just really like to see some narrative discussion around what areas or what aspects of these proposals need to be better detailed and worked out, because I think there's still a lot of things up for discussions, and, primarily thinking about in the SCE proposal, that exceedance methodology aspect I was raising earlier, and then with some of the other proposals as well, how exactly the resource counting is going to work, and the validations and setting the PRM and those sort of things are all still pretty nebulous in my mind from what I've heard so far throughout all these discussions. So just curious if there's any, been any other sidebar discussions about that sort of thing. And if no one wants to, go ahead if you want to answer, Peter. Thanks.
Yeah, no, this is Peter Griffiths with PG&E. The facilitators have met to discuss the workshop report and what that workshop report is going to look like. Part of that workshop report is going to include statements of the formal proposals that have been made during the workshops, and we've requested that the proposers of those proposals essentially write up essentially what their proposal is, along the lines of sort of what the structure is, what the counting rules are, what the requirements and allocation mechanisms are, and then essentially have anyone who has weighed in on modifying any of those proposals also to weigh in. But the idea, Chris, is to have the proposing parties essentially write those up, including discussions of what things need to be determined and what the next steps would be for determining those aspects to be implemented. And that is intended to be part of the report. The report will also include a matrix of trying to basically soliciting parties' positions on various aspects that have been brought up in the discussions. And so the matrix, I believe, will be sent out in the next day or so, and that will be a chance for parties to weigh in on what their take is or what their positions are. So the intent of the report is to have a description of each of the proposals, have a description of some of the modifications to each of those proposals, if there are say alternative counting rules and things, as well as having each proposal lay out sort of what the next steps are to be able to get to move forward. So that's somewhat of the plan. I don't know, Chris, if that answers your question or if you have further questions from that.
I think it does, Peter. I think it does answer it, and I think it seems that it's probably best to let those proposers, the parties that are proposing various things, actually describe what they view that, and then everyone can make their more formal comments on what else may or may not need to be included there as that process works its way out forward. So that sounds fine to me. I just wanted to make sure that there was going to be perhaps some level of indication of what things need to get worked on, going forward, so that there's some sense that the PUC has that there may need to be additional discussions or additional proceeding tracks or things along those lines to help implement this, and that sort of concept gets captured. I'm pretty confident it will be, and it sounds like that approach is acceptable, and we'll certainly get to that. So thanks for that, Peter.
Yeah, let me also add that there will also be chapters on some of the other topics such as hedging, as well as the multi-year forward and UCAP will also be included in those discussions, and right up in the report.
That sounds good. I guess I would just also ask: is there going to be like an iterative process for the work group report itself? Like people seeing the draft, I've seen, I've heard that before in other proceedings previously, where there's kind of the draft one gets sent out, and then people can kind of, hey, this is characterized some way, and debate it a little bit further after the kind of first drafting process. Have you guys, is there a plan for that in the next steps?
Chris, I think the thinking is that at this point is that because there needs to be substantial amount of write-up done, there isn't a whole lot of time for a draft and comments to come back on that draft before it goes to the commission. Okay. I will note that the commission has indicated that there are comments and reply comments are in scope in the new RAOIR. So when that exactly is going to take place, it's unclear because it hasn't been scheduled yet. But there is going to be a chance for parties to comment and provide comments and reply comments on the workshop report.
Okay, that sounds good, Peter. I would just say that, if that's the case, I guess on this work group report, I would just urge folks that are drafting it to just really be as neutral as possible on including, compare and contrast type of characterizations or pros and cons of different aspects of the proposals, because I think there's been a lot of disagreement on this in these meetings, and so something that's less subjective and just more straight to the point about what are the facts that we all have agreed on would I think be really what I would recommend, trying to avoid having any kind of mischaracterization of different parties' proposals and pros and cons of different proposals, that sort of thing. So I know that's treading a fine line and it's a big ask, but I just that just seems to be my sense of how this would be the most fair outcome for everyone, as opposed to perhaps folks holding the pen, maybe characterizing things the way that they see fit. So that's all I'll say, and I'll wrap it up with that. Thanks.
Well, I got to say, Lisa has reminded me by putting the next steps up. Informal comments we will be taking informal comments on everything that has been discussed, on all of the proposals and on all of the different topics discussed, and that final set of informal comments essentially. It will essentially be part of the report. That we will include that as part of the report. So parties should be able to weigh in on what their views are on what the proposals are. We also will be sending out a relatively straightforward matrix, a position matrix that we'll be looking for having parties to report back or send back to us by the 4th of February. And essentially the matrix will be collated to some degree with what the responses are, and the comments, essentially the informal comments on the whole process and the proposals will be included in the report. So there's plenty of opportunity for parties to weigh in on what's in the report and what their thinking is about what's in the report.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That all sounds really, fair to me. So I think everybody will have their fair, chance to give input. So I'll let others chime in here. I see there's others on the list. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Chris. Doug? Doug Carpa? Your hand is up.
It is, yes. I'm trying to get myself off mute. I did have a procedural question kind of along similar lines. So in the process, we had discussed the possibility of other parties putting forward proposals on load obligation trading and possibly unbundling of resources. And I realize we haven't gotten those together yet. I was hoping to bring forward something on the load obligation piece. I think other parties may be thinking about doing something on the resource unbundling part, and I was just wanted to get guidance on like how best to put that forward. And when, mindful of the fact that we're kind of at the end of days here with the workshop process. And so I don't know if there are any thoughts on how that might be handled.
Yeah, Doug, if you have proposals that you would like to be included as proposals, please write those up, or at least write those up in terms of what they are, how they would fit in, again, sort of what that is, and those will be included in the report if we receive them.
Okay.
So
and put those maybe in formal comments for the 4th.
Yes.
Okay. I think I can get that done. Yeah, and apologies to everybody for not getting that to everyone earlier to look at. Although I think they've mostly been described verbally, but we never got around to putting in anything formal. So it's like, let's remedy.
Yeah,
okay,
no,
great,
I
thanks.
mean, the intent isn't to leave anything out. And so if people have things that haven't been sort of formally presented that they would like included, they should put them in either write them up as separate proposals, or put them in the informal comments.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Paul, your hand is up.
Hi, yeah, this is Paul on behalf of CLECA. To follow up what Chris said, I would avoid for the working group report, labeling anything as pros and cons. I think it needs to be more factual of what proposals do or will do. I mean, because one of the problems is if you try to label anything as a pro or a con, my pro may be one of your cons. And so there will constantly always be a disagreement if you try to do it that way in a working group report. I mean, hopefully like I said, this to be determined of comments and reply comments. I mean, that will be a time for parties can then advocate, from the more factual, what they view as a pro or a con in a particular proposal. But I think that will help, at least with the working group report, to sort of, like you said, be neutral as possible.
Well, Paul, I think the intent is that anything that is put in the neutral or put into the working group report will have an author, and that author will be named.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So that it wouldn't be sort of a working group report that there isn't stuff that is sort of attributable to the working group per se. It'll be attributable to essentially a particular party.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the clarification.
David?
Yeah, just a comment picking up on what's been discussed in the side in the chat. Please send your informal comments to both the service lists because R19 is technically closed. So they need to go to both.
Thanks, David.
Hey, Peter, this is Noah Tome from Middle River Power. Just a quick question on when the facilitators expect maybe to have a first draft of the workshop report, given that it's due on the 28th of February.
No, that's a good question. I don't know that the facilitator group has come up with probably a timeline on exactly when that will be. We are requesting that we get almost all of the materials that will go into it by February 4th.
All right, so as I wait for additional questions and hand raise, I'm just gonna go over next steps. And if we wrap up early, we wrap up early. So in terms of next steps, as we've sort of touched on throughout today, the co-facilitators have moved the deadline for the last set of informal comments to February 4th. We are asking folks to put in your thoughts for everything, not just the UCAP and the multi-year requirement. I will be sending out this email reminder to the service list with the position matrix likely tomorrow. And as Peter noted, this final set of informal comments will be included. We recognize that some folks have voiced that their thoughts have changed throughout. So we're hoping that this informal comments, this last set, will encompass your thoughts up to this point. The report will be due on the 28th, and tentatively in the commission's scoping memo, there are opportunities for comments and reply comments, but the dates are haven't been set yet. And sometime in summer of 2022, we are expecting the PD for this reform track. So I'm going to pause and see if there are any other questions related to process, or if there are any more questions for the presenters from today.
Hey, Lisa, this is Greg Klatt. I don't know if doesn't look like there's any questions, but before we all sign off, we should all thank Lisa too. She's done tireless work behind the scenes and has really kind of been the continuity for the co-facilitators and the logistics, and even beyond that. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Greg. That's very kind of you. Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone who spoke today. We had 6 different organizations. It's a lot of work to get all your decks together, I can only imagine. And also to everyone who presented throughout these 10 workshops, and everyone who attends, because we typically get from like 70 to 120 people a day for each workshop. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. We all look forward to reading your comments. Oh, we have a hand raised. Barbara, go ahead.
I just thought you might want to remind people that a lot of the information is posted on the PUC website if they wanted to go back and look at something while they're putting their thoughts together.
Great point, Barbara. Yes, the links to all the decks, all the recordings are available on the Commission's RA History webpage. I will add the link into the chat, so if you don't jump off too soon, you can grab it. Yes, that is a very good point. And there's a lot of work that went into all those decks in the presentation. So good point, Barbara. But with that, I am going to return a lot of time back to everyone. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward to reading all your comments.